There's nothing really like Bully. In the years since release, Rockstar Vancouver's Bart Simpson simulator has become a bit of a cult classic, overshadowed by bigger names getting bigger and bigger sequels. But behind every Grand Theft Auto 5 and Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2 is quiet behind-the-scenes work on a sequel to Bully, going through multiple iterations for over 15 years. But the story of Bully 2 is a lot like gossip in high school. Rumors, hearsay, and some equivalent to notes being passed in class are the name of the game. But it's also a cyclical story, one showing both how Rockstar has changed, but also how, deep down, things have stayed the same. It's a subject I've been putting off for far too long. It was one of the original ideas that I planned on doing for this channel. So, it's time to finally investigate Rockstar's Bully 2. Rockstar likes to take its time on sequels. That probably seems obvious in the current landscape where massive gaps between GTA 5 and 6 or Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2 are the norm, but even back in 2008 when the company was releasing titles more frequently, getting far out from a release before starting work on a follow-up was a good way to see what worked and what didn't. So when the team at Rockstar Vancouver finished up work on the then PS2 exclusive Bully in 2006, they didn't immediately turn around and begin work on a sequel. What the team in Canada did instead was turn to a project they've been putting off for quite some time, Max Payne 3, a series they'd taken over from Remedy Entertainment. At that same time in Andover, Massachusetts, Mad Dog Studios would strike a deal with Rockstar to remaster Bully for the new generation. While development wrapped up on the Scholarship Edition, however, Rockstar would also move in to acquire the studio in 2008, redubbing it Rockstar New England. It's here that work on Bully 2 begins. Rockstar, when acquiring new studios, liked first to give them a project that would test them, offering a proverbial trial by fire right out of the gate to have the team prove they were worth the investment. For Angel Studios, which became Rockstar San Diego in 2002, that came in the form of the PS2 version of Agent, and with it 12 and 14-hour workdays and unprecedented crunch for a project that would never release. The early days of Rockstar New England weren't much different. In 2008, producer and Rockstar co-founder Dan Houser would pen a script for the opening and give a rough outline to a sequel to Bully, handing it over to the team in New England. While not a lot of details on the actual story are known, per interviews with former developers provided by both the YouTuber SWEGTA and corroborated by Video Game Chronicles, the intention was to take Jimmy Hopkins out of the halls of Bulworth Academy for summer vacation, finding himself in a new home in a new town, clashing with a new stepfamily. Both the sources mentioned before and Blake Hester's 2022 article that provided the most in-depth look at Bully 2 we've had point to a Camp Krusty-style summer camp and Kids on Bike-style movies such as Porky's and Goonies being direct inspiration for the school's out attitude. Concept art leaked on Twitter by GTA Feeds, formerly Bully 2 Info, in 2017, definitely show off this feeling with a more cartoony twist, focused heavily on the types of characters Jimmy would encounter in a more suburban environment. That being said, even with this small of a picture of the story, there's 2 points I could see being a problem. For one, there's something to be said about this being a direct sequel to the original, starring Jimmy and all. While I do think he's among my favorite Rockstar protagonists, I can't help but want something a little different. Part of the appeal of GTA's revolving door of protagonists is the real opportunity to show different sides of the criminal underworld and to get rid of the baggage of previous stories. Even Red Dead Redemption 2, which is a prequel and could have easily just starred a younger John Marston, gives the players another completely different character to see the world through. I can see the other side, for sure. This isn't something Rockstar typically does, with one big exception, and so there's potential here to flesh Jimmy out even further. I think for me personally, though, this is something I probably would have been okay with had this version of Bully come out, but as we get further and further away from the first game and Rockstar changes into what they are today, for better or worse, the idea of going back to Jimmy's story doesn't appeal to me in the same way it would have during the Xbox 360 generation. But again, that could just be me. On a similar note, the idea of doing a sequel to Bully on summer break seems cool at first, but I'd be curious if it would kind of miss the point and appeal of the first game. Starting a mission only for it to clash with your chemistry class or have you out past curfew was where a lot of the emergent gameplay came from. Few games have me checking the clock as much as the first Bully, and while it gets pretty easy to avoid as the town opens up, throwing it away or downplaying the rigid structure of being a teenager does seem a little less fun, I guess. especially since developers have talked about building out better stealth mechanics. Again, in 2008, when it hadn't been so long since the original, I may have disagreed, but now when there's truly nothing else that feels like Bully, fleshing out the classes, the feeling of risk versus reward, and the stealth mechanics that come with truancy feels like a better option. It was, to be fair, pretty early in development, and I don't think it's unlikely summer school, odd jobs around town, or even merit badges from the summer camp or something could supplement the class structure, but it feels like their goal was more the lack of responsibility and freedom of being a kid. Back at Rockstar New England, however, things were a long way from summer vacation. While Mad Dog had its own version of crunch culture before they were acquired, oftentimes as a game was nearing release, which was kind of the industry norm, it was nothing compared to the way Rockstar did things. One Rockstar producer during the acquisition phase would paint a perfect picture on how they did things by saying, well, we don't work every weekend. Like with Rockstar San Diego before, 12 and 14-hour workdays would be the norm. And it went beyond a cultural expectation, with devs trying to leave at a reasonable times being met with harassment at the door. Not that it's any excuse or justification, but those at Rockstar New England were excited about what they were working on. Their goal was to have Bully be of a smaller scale, but equally impressive part of Rockstar's catalog, standing alongside GTA and the still in development Red Dead Redemption series, with it moving away from Rockstar's previous engine, Criterion's Renderware, and into the new proprietary Rage engine. Years later, when the GTA 5 source code would leak and information from Bully 2 would be found, it seems like it was from around this time, as Rage was still fairly new and other canceled projects that were found were from a similar time period. With that new engine, however, came new goals. While the world would be bigger, New England also wanted to focus on fleshing out the social aspects. NPCs were to truly remember Jimmy's actions in a way that extended beyond the 20-foot radius and 5-second memories seen in other Rockstar games. It was sort of an extension of what was being developed by other teams with Red Dead Redemption's early reputation system, going beyond the little tasks given by townsfolk and other students and the relatively linear faction relationships of the first game, and turning positive or negative encounters into unique consequences. While again, game development isn't necessarily linear, a large portion of this version of Bully 2 was playable at this point, with some devs pointing to between 6 and 8 hours of gameplay finished, with assets from GTA acting as placeholders. That's a pretty good amount for 15 months of work. However, in June of 2009, Rockstar New England would be hit with layoffs. The reasoning behind this is a bit unclear. Some of it, like the shuttering of the QA department, can be chalked up to Rockstar wanting to utilize their own testers instead, but by some estimates, around 10% of the studio was also cut, including artists and other staff members, which feels pretty drastic for a studio that had been under the Rockstar umbrella for less than 2 years. Those that were left would be gradually shifted to the held-together with duct tape development of Red Dead Redemption and the often delayed Max Payne 3, until eventually work on Bully 2 would completely stop. The culture at Rockstar New England got worse, as more and more developers would leave the studio, and the excitement of working with the company would fade. Pieces of the sequel, such as new glass physics and the rope effects for the tripwire, would end up in both Max Payne 3 and Red Dead respectively, as New England would prove invaluable support on the development despite everything. Following the release of Red Dead Redemption, information on Bully 2 admittedly goes a bit quiet. Many of the developers that spoke to sources like SWEGTA and Game Informer either left or were laid off by 2010, and it seemed that Bully 2 was entirely cancelled at Rockstar New England. However, in 2019, when VGC would move to corroborate some of the information from one of SWEGTA's videos, their source would state that work on Bully 2 had started up sometime between the release of Red Dead Redemption and 2013, with the team likely being folded in to help finish up the last stages of GTA 5, and the project fizzling out as a result after only a year and a half of development. While VGC goes as far to state that this second iteration of Bully 2 was at Rockstar New England, part of me wonders if that's actually the case. With the development of Max Payne 3 wrapping up in the same timeframe, it seems likely that the Bully series would revert back to Rockstar Vancouver, which sort of falls in line with what Dan Houser was saying to the press at the time, despite us now knowing that a version of Bully 2 had already been in development. After all, the two artists VGC cites as leads on this version, Drew Medina and Stephen Olds, weren't exclusive to the team in New England. However, only a few days before the release of Max Payne 3, Rockstar Vancouver would be folded into Rockstar Toronto, with devs being offered positions across the company, essentially closing the Vancouver studio. Additionally, Stephen Olds seems to have departed the studio sometime in 2009 and moved somewhere under the Activision umbrella. While to be honest, I think it's more likely that VGC's source was either misremembering or part of a relatively small team carrying the pre-production torch before Rockstar's schedule would open up post-GTA 5, there is one other clue from this time. In 2013, one voice actor, Stan Captain, on his blog would hint that he was working on an unannounced project at Rockstar Games. Captain, who has uncredited roles in Bully, San Andreas, and Liberty City stories, doesn't go as far to say that the game he's working on was Bully 2, but that his work would be with Rockstar in Ontario, Canada, and that we could probably piece it together. At this point, with the only public information about Bully 2 being that interview mentioned wanting their Canadian team to do a Bully sequel after Max Payne, it's safe to assume that this was what he was implying. To take both Captain and VGC at their word, it seems like at least some work on Bully 2 had been passed off to Canada after the release of Max Payne 3. Regardless, Captain would update the blog to mention the project had been cancelled in November 2013 before he could record any lines. Again, take this all with a grain of salt. It's hard to talk about this era of the company without talking about how GTA 5 changed Rockstar. To the public, that came in the form of larger and larger gaps between releases, with the growing monolith of online seemingly taking all of their attention. Internally, however, the company was in the middle of disputes with longtime producer Leslie Benzies over the future direction of the company. Common sentiment tends to point to Benzies wanting to do more with online, and the Housers looking toward a single-player future. The former, after all, took charge of fixing online's rocky launch, and Dan Houser, even with the case of Bully 2, had more often than not been the quote-unquote story guy. However, despite that gap between games, word on Bully 2 never really went quiet. Rumors of recording sessions and subtitles like Kevin's Backjack or Senior Year come out of this time period, and while some of these were definitely untrue, there seems to be some evidence that something Bully-related was being worked on behind the scenes. Shortly before the release of 5, two things would happen. 1, Bully's trademark would be renewed, and 2, Dan Houser would elaborate further on where his head was at with the future of Jimmy Hopkins, stating that a second Bully was absolutely something he was willing to do, and that he didn't see a grown-up Jimmy becoming a future GTA protagonist when the idea was floated by the interviewer. On top of that, an employee at Rockstar New England would tease on his CV that he was working on the, quote, next version of a famous IP. Well, again, there's no confirmation that this was Bully 2, and this unnamed employee would depart the studio by 2014, which may have been early enough for Red Dead 2. Their resume now only reflects Max Payne 3 and GTA 5. This, alongside the renewal of that Bully trademark, seems to reflect that what had previously fizzled out had now spun back up in some capacity. Which is why in 2014, when an earnings call with Take-Two would hint at a new Rockstar game coming by April the next year, outlets would rightfully speculate that this was surely Bully 2 finally seeing the light of day. It was, however, the first of many re-releases of GTA 5, a sort of sign of what was to come. It's around this time, however, that the enthusiasm around a potential Bully sequel develops into a sort of cottage industry, and with that came its fair share of hoaxes. To speak plainly, this video could probably go on forever if I talked about every single piece of unsubstantiated rumor or supposed leak from this time. It's really a testament to how longed for an unannounced game like this was, that even something easily disproven like Bully 2 Senior Year could briefly be taken at face value. So in the interest of fairness, Bully 2 Senior Year was shown off as coming soon on one of those doctors hate him style clickbait websites that feature on the sidebar of other sites and had a quote from Dan Houser that is wholly fabricated. This was 2015, and I'd like to think we've gotten a little better at identifying obvious misinformation like this in the following decade or so, which the creators of this website seem to agree with since they stopped publishing fake articles right at the start of the pandemic. The other big rumor around this time is the one responsible for my curiosity around a Bully sequel. In May of 2017, Game Informer would add a page to their website titled Bully 2 Kevin's Backjack. With E3 around the corner and Game Informer being a print magazine who often got scoops and assets a little early as publication had a little extra lead time, the internet was briefly ablaze. At that E3, however, Game Informer online content director Ben Reeves told a different story.
We have internship training, which involves running through a lot of things in the back end of the magazine. And we set up a lot of stuff and we make jokes, you know, try to make it fun for the kids. And joke about a lot of stuff like Destiny 3, haha, oh, Half-Life 3, wouldn't that be funny if they made that? And one of the ones that we were like running through, making a skew was Bully 2. Yeah. Which, you know, why not?
There have been rumors.
And we try to make these things sound ridiculous because like if they ever actually go online, we don't want people to think they're real, right?
Of course,
Because that would be stupid.
That would be irresponsible.
So
would report on that.
I wrote Bully 2 Kevin's Back Jack, thinking nobody would ever think it's real.
Was this like recently or was this like months ago and it's been sitting there lying in wait?
I think it was back in January.
Fantastic.
And somebody noticed it last week and changed my life.
Yeah.
This honestly does sound in line with what I've heard about how nightmarish the Game Informer website was and likely still is, and it is still a bit funny to me that enough articles were made about a mistake like this that it'll still sometimes come up in Google suggestions. Even my long-dead review show from college referenced Kevin's Back Jack in our review of Bully over a year later. In journalism, corrections are far too often overshadowed by the mistake. So was Bully 2 actually being worked on at this time? It's hard to say. On one hand, per that original Game Informer article from Blake Hester, remnants of the social systems ended up in Red Dead 2 almost 10 years later. Similarly, a casting call from, quote, a leading UK-based developer asking for a 13 to 17-year-old male to read lines at Pinewood for a middle school bully are both curious instances that may show the project was on Rockstar's mind even this late, but don't point to anything actually tangible. That being said, when discussing the production of GTA 6 in 2020, prominent leaker in the community, Tez, who was partially responsible for uncovering the canceled GTA DLC covered on this channel in 2024, would state that production on Bully 2 would end in 2017 or so, in the lead up to Red Dead 2. While Tez states that it's likely they did that to further focus on the gradual ramping up of GTA 6 development, what we know of Red Dead 2's development shows all of Rockstar being pulled onto the latter, with the project spinning up to 100-hour weeks in 2018. This would be corroborated by another leaker, Yan2295, on Reddit. While I'm not often in the business of trusting people who claim to be leakers wholesale like this, both have a fairly solid track record and have spoken to actual publications in the past. There's reason to believe that they could be telling the truth. I also think it goes without saying that in the 5-year gap between GTA 5 and Red Dead 2, it's unlikely that Arthur Morgan's story and the numerous GTA Online updates were the only thing being worked on at Rockstar. In the same way that I don't think the 7 years between Red Dead 2 and GTA 6 have been exclusively dedicated to Jason and Lucia. I do think this is pretty thin, however. With that though, two other things would happen that conflict with each other around this time. On one side, in early 2021, Yan would confirm that Bully 2 was officially dead, but by the end of the year, relatively trusted source Tom Henderson of Insider Gaming would state in the lead up to the Game Awards that Bully 2 was expected to make a surprise appearance, going as far to state that a new playable version had been seen by other journalists and that it wasn't the one that was in development years ago. Henderson, for what it's worth, does stick to this even after GTA 6 was announced in full development at the start of the next year. Perhaps like before, what was cancelled in the lead up to both Red Deads was picked back up after release and was either cancelled once again or maybe seen sometime after 6. It's hard to say. I'm not sure if we'll ever see a Bully 2, but it feels unlikely. The only official word from Rockstar in the sequel came from Dan Houser, who's no longer at the company. With the success of Online, it seems their more smaller-scale ideas and efforts are reserved for maintaining it and its sequel under 6, with new titles being these once-in-a-generation style events. Something like a Bully 2 doesn't seem to fit in with their model anymore. But those leaks from Henderson and Tez and so on paint a story of a Rockstar who seems compelled to make it. Whittling away for 10 or so years with small teams or in the earliest stages of pre-production doesn't happen for no reason, and Henderson's notes point to it surviving Houser's departure. The story of Bully 2 seems to be the story of history repeating itself. And so with Rockstar acquiring former LA Noire director Brendan McNamara's new studio, despite the disastrous development of that game and redubbing it Rockstar Australia, it's hard to not see an opportunity for the cycle to begin again. And at the same time, those not-so-accurate leaks, those trends on Twitter, and the countless videos on the subject show a fan base dying to play it. And so it's hard to not get excited about even the smallest glimmer of hope.